Okay, great. That was fun in the first half, riffing on this question about what are the diseases of the ego and hearing your reflections, some looking at it, kind of a theoretical sense, but a lot of you also sharing your personal experiences, which is great. And that's where the home play will go for this week is to look further into the personal, where you see areas of your life and other people's lives around you where there's work to be done, both in terms of the functions of the ego that we learned about last week and the diseases of the ego that we're going to be learning about tonight. And how you can further that. And maybe you're going to also come up with some new insights into more of the functions as you see it personally and more of the diseases as you see it personally. And what I'm presenting is by no means exhaustive. This is, things I've accumulated over my lifetime, years of experience, study, working as a spiritual psychotherapist and whatnot. In other words, what George Carlin calls brain droppings. So to start tonight, looking at the diseases of the ego, I want to pick up again with the idea of the ego as a center. The word means I, and you are a I center or an I am center. And in fact, I like to think of it as the center of the center of the center, because this impulse for the I am awareness is at the center of what we can call the self. And then, of course, the self is shrouded or, decorated with the personality that you create for the self, how you dress yourself, how you speak, how you express. It's your personality of the self. And at the center of that is this awareness of the ego. So the ego is really the center of the center of the center. And reminds me of the saying by the Greek philosopher, I'm going to get his name wrong, Empedocles, who said that God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. It's kind of like a cone, a mysterious paradoxical saying, but I like it because it just emphasizes the fact that this divine nature is present in multiple centers. And in a way, your center is a reflection of the all that we all have. Some think of it as the holographic universe, that every center represents the whole. And so, yeah, we all are centers on that scale, on that level. And we have this capacity to become aware of the center and also aware of other centers. But somehow, does life ever feel like bumper cars? I think of the bumper cars at Centerville on Toronto Island, where everybody's bumping around into other centers. Although some people are like moving around, trying not to bump anybody or get bumped, but before the time runs out. And then other people is like, how many people can I bump before the time runs out? So yeah, life can be like all these centers as bumper cars, which in fact can make us feel uncentered. So here we go now into, the problem of existence, where as a center, we can become uncentered. And a sense of loss of our center. Like, where's my center? And perhaps we divest that sense of a center to something outside of ourselves, to some other center, some other super ego. And this can lead to what I call the lost soul syndrome, where a person doesn't have a strong connection, and the lost soul syndrome. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to think. They don't even know what to feel. And this is where, it becomes really imperative to get back to our center. Otherwise, we're vulnerable. And if we don't have something in our center, then problems like strange fires can inhabit our center, which I'll be talking about next week, where people get filled with strange fires or false centers, other centers that will come and fill. So this necessitates attending to and maintaining, and in some cases, rebuilding our center, which is what I was talking to with Mata during the break. She was asking that exact question, after going through some ego death and letting things go, how do you know what to do next? And that's a big question. And I was sharing how, this takes time. It takes building skills. It takes developing connection to something higher, so that, you can grow up and grow down at the same time. This is kind of the paradox of paradoxes, is that as a spiritual being, growing up means something is growing down and into us. Won't go into that right now, but we'll get to that later down the road when we talk about spiritual and ego death and rebirth. But right now, I want to talk about ogres and idiots.
What?
That's right, ogres and idiots. Yes, ogres and idiots. I love ogres. I love Shrek. This past summer, I went and saw the musical Shrek here in town. It was so good, I went back a few days later and saw it a second time. I love something that grabs me, that I can really sink my teeth into and analyze it. And it really, I saw, the correlation between ogres and the ego. And it's a delightful musical that opens up with this big number at the top, where Shrek's parents are saying, okay, Shrek, you're growing up now. You're already 7 years old. They pack him a sandwich, and it's time for you to go away. And this number at the beginning, I'm going to read some of the lyrics as they're sending Shrek out the door. And you'll find somewhere to go. It's a big, bright, beautiful world with happiness all around. It's peaches and cream. And every dream comes true, but not for you. It's a big, bright, beautiful world with possibilities everywhere. And just around the bend, there is a friend or two, but not for you. But not for you. We're ugly, son, which means life is harder. People hate the things they cannot understand. And this is very true. This is what creates ogres. We create ogres in our society because we don't understand people that are different. They don't necessarily fit in. They don't look, beautiful in the classic sense, or they don't think the same way, that fits into the educational system. So they get shunned, they get spurned and pushed out, and they become these isolated ogres. And so Shrek, later on in the musical, he sings a number called "Who'd I Be?" Who would I be, if he was accepted? He says, "An ogre always hides. An ogre's fate is known. An ogre always stays in the dark and all alone. Yes, I'd be a hero if my wish were granted. Life would be enchanted. Of course I'd be a hero, and I would scale a tower to save a hothouse flower and carry her away. That's how it would be. A big, bright, beautiful world, but not for me." So, and then later on, we get to really see the inside of Shrek when he starts to explain to somebody about how ogres are like onions, right? They've got layers. And when you peel back the layers of an ogre, you find that they're not so ugly and horrible, but they're actually quite sensitive inside. In Shrek, he has this beautiful sensitive side. But it's a beautiful metaphor because, you know, ogres really show this undervalued and underinflated side of the ego, where the ego's like, oh, nobody loves me, nobody accepts me, nobody understands me, and they have to withdraw and they go into their own little world in some dark, miserable swamp and are really an outcast of society. And we know people like that. They just live alone. And maybe they live their life just through books. That's their life, is other people's stories and adventures. Mm. And that's sort of one end of the spectrum, just an ogre quietly there. We don't even notice them. The other end of the spectrum is when an ogre blows up, like somebody takes a gun, walks into a high school and starts shooting people down because they've had enough. They don't like being pushed out. They don't like not being accepted and not being valued, and they just want to blow everything up. So again, a picture of an ego in this kind of ogrehood when they're undervalued and deflated. So now the other side, we're talking about ogres and idiots, and we're not using the word idiot in the usual sense of the term, when we say, oh, you're such an idiot, for doing such and such. Actually, the word idiot comes from the Greek idios, and it means one's own. Idios, one's own. I first learned this word when I was doing, in my 20s, doing biblical research. I was studying biblical texts and scriptures in the Greek and in the Aramaic and Hebrew. And I came across this line that said, each one went unto their own home. Idios, one's own. Each one went to one's own home, idios. And so the true meaning of the word idiot is someone who lives in their own little world. They just have their own private little world and they choose to be that way. It's not like an ogre that's been shunned and cast out of society, but the idiot, for whatever reason, they have their own private ideas that they don't want to share. They don't want to engage with the world. They become very self-centered. And it's a problem because with time, they harden into that and can't get beyond the walls of their own self. They become trapped in their own personality. Or in some cases, an idiot just has no personality. They're not interested in having a personality. They're just in one's own little world. So they don't need a personality to interact with other people. And the idiot will tend to deflect and repel and shirk from encounters with other people. So it's unfortunate because the idiot doesn't blossom in the garden of humanity, sharing their talents, sharing their knowledge, and having an exchange with one another. And so they tend to default into a caricature of what they're destined to be. Or I like to use the word transmogrification. Love this word, transmogrification. Rather than transforming, and developing with one's potential, transmogrify means that they change, but they change into something that's grotesque and buffoonish, like a clown caricature. But it's not funny, it's actually sad because they're really just trapped as an idiot in their own little world. And this is not the objective of individuation. We are all meant to individuate and come into our own, but not at the cost of losing connections to others, which is the scenario of the idiot. They lose connections with others. So they haven't really individuated. They just closed off. So yeah, there's this polarity of the ogre not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy, and then the idiot who's more self-righteous and the sense of entitlement to just be private and not share with the rest of the world. And in light of that, I like to say, the disease state of all humanity is that we're all creeps. We're all creeps. Let's just accept that, We're all creeps because we're evolving in the swampaverse. We're coming from a lower state into a higher state of egohood. And we see that in the animal kingdom, from lower creeps and spiders and things like that into higher, mammals and whatnot. So it's the same parallel with our ego nature. We start out as creeps, creepy, and trying to evolve into something higher. Yeah, as we start to go now looking more at the specifics of diseases of the ego, we're seeing that these are disturbances or aberrations, transmogrifications off the intended path of the evolutionary path. And really the proper term for diseases is egotism. Egotism. And that's the egotism we want to correct and get rid of. We don't want to get rid of the ego. The ego is this kernel of the self that has self-awareness. We just want to get rid of any form of egotism. And also to address the question of how the ego can be subject to diseases is, as I explained in a previous session, that the ego is not simply a functional thing, like ego functions, function. It's not only functional, but it's also corporeal, which means that it is a body. It is a body unto itself. And this does share with the Eastern perspective that we have different bodies or koshas that are nested within one another. And the highest of that is this ego I am that's nested within these other bodies that I showed in that chart from the week before the slide that you can go back and look at. And if this body is not fed and maintained the same way the physical body is, where, we digest, there's assimilation, elimination, and integration of information and experience, right? That's how the ego grows. It's through digestion, assimilation, elimination, and integration of experience and knowledge. If we're not doing that, being active in that way, and I forget who it was in the opening circle was sharing how, they were active with their thought life and artistry, then there can be a distortion. There can be a distortion and inertia take place that can lead to, what really presents itself as mental health issues. Mental health issues, sure, there can be problems on the chemical level, but at the highest level, it's ego issues. Mental health issues are informing us that there's ego issues. And I see that in people all the time when I work as a spiritual psychotherapist. And that's why I sometimes call myself the ego doctor, because I'm trying to help correct what is out of balance on the highest level that manifests as an imbalance on the mental level, the emotional level, and even right down into the physical level. It's kind of a chicken or egg type of thing. Is the chemical balance causing ego issues and mental issues, or is it the mental issues and ego issues that's causing the chemical imbalance? So it's really important that we maintain this inner life in a hygienic way, and we'll talk more about that next week, because when we get the wrong sorts of thoughts into the mind and building the ego, then it's going to distort our perceptions of everything else. When we look out through our lens, everything else is going to be tilted because we're tilted inside because we've integrated erroneous ideas and misinformation. This is why, I get my back up a little bit when I see so-called spiritual teachers teaching things like you don't have to do anything, just sit around like at Osho's ashram. Oh yeah, you can drink beer and have sex all the time. There's nothing else to do. You want to turn off your mind anyways. Don't think for yourself. Everybody wear red and let me be your super ego. This is pseudo Buddha babble that leads to the transmogrification and imbalance of things. And we saw that amongst his disciples. I know James said he watched the Netflix series on Osho, all 6 parts. And just how the whole thing went south because it wasn't really based on solid foundation of knowledge and information. So there's traps out there. There's traps out there that can block the ego. So we really have to think for ourselves and make up our own minds about the information that we take in and integrate. I want to go to the slideshow. I'm going to share. And let me just, I was going to review briefly here the functions of the ego. Self-awareness, that's awareness of one's own center. Awareness of other. This is a healthy capacity for empathy. By the way, this slideshow is accessible to go back and look at. I'll put the link is in the Google Doc and also the video itself. Identity on the different levels, our physical identity, personality, or status, our spiritual identity. Boundary setter, a sense of separateness and personal distinction, important for protection. Freedom seeker and freedom fighter, this sense of free thought and a free mind. And with our mind, we are a knower, a cognizer, a thinker, which has both a subjective and objective capacity. That's the ego thinking, not the brain. And organizer, through digestion, assimilation, elimination, and integration of experiences, the ego organizes information for the inner life, wisdom and power. The builder of the self into a new edifice antenna between the material and spiritual realms. We'll get into that more later. This is really, an ultimate destination for the ego, to be this edifice antenna. A chooser, capacity for choices, especially of a higher nature, moral choices. A lover. Love is a choice to connect to the other. It's not just a brain-based thing or emotion. It's an action of the ego. And then the sovereign. Be sovereign oversees the entire project of making choices to build a free self. And the acronym SELF is a self-stylized, evolutionary, loving fashionista. So now, diseases of the ego center. So to become uncentered, this loss of center dissolved rather than a process of death, rebirth, and development. Not centered in the body. We don't have our awareness in the body. We're being exvoluted all the time, pulled outward. And this can certainly be a cause of anxiety, fear, and panic, because it really ties into this thing of fear of death. The lost soul syndrome, I mentioned that. This is the inability to navigate the mental, emotional, and spiritual planes, and therefore unable to manifest anything sustainable on the physical plane. People are trying to manifest things, but they're not really manifesting from their own center. Codependency. This is a dependency on other people as centers rather than an independence from other centers, and then a healthy interdependence with others. Big difference between codependency and interdependence. Lack of capacity for empathy, which is to sense the center of another, to know what they're feeling, to know what they're experiencing. That's empathy. And without that capacity, there can be very antisocial and even sociopathic tendencies. That's one of the flags of a sociopath, is they cannot really have a sense of empathy for anything outside of themselves. Or to be stuck in one's own center with a distorted view of the self, lacking healthy mirroring from others. Really important to have connection to others to mirror us in a healthy way, so we can have not a distorted view, but a more accurate view. That's one of the benefits of being a center among centers in a circle. Narcissistic, talk more about that tonight. This is an addiction to attention and admiration from others. Inflation and deflation means an over or underestimation of oneself and one's power and ability and talent. Again, this is a distorted view of the self. Poor boundaries. Suffering what some people call the empath syndrome. People go, oh, I'm an empath. I can't be around people. I pick up their energies and their thoughts. That's really a sympath syndrome. We come into sympathetic resonance with other people and we can't get out of other people's vibrational fields. Why? Because you have a weak center. You come into resonance with other people's centers and you can't hold on to your own center because you haven't built it up. Yes, this number 10, the weak inner life. This often requires verbal processing. For people that have a weak inner life, they have to talk about things. They can't think. They have to verbal process, and this results in talking too much, which leads to a further weakening of their center. Or number 11 is the opposite. They speak too little. There's a loss of voice, and this can come from the loss of self, the loss of the center. And then 12, arrogance, hubris, pride, and lack of IH. That's the new buzzword, IH, intellectual humility. How important it is to actively work at developing intellectual humility, because we're growing as intellectuals and we're growing with the amount of intel we have. So to practice hygiene, we have to practice intellectual humility, hygiene of our inner life. We need to practice intellectual humility. And then last, a mismatcher. A mismatcher is someone who frequently disagrees with others, but then says the same things themselves and takes credit. I actually made a slide for this because this is one of my favorites or at least one of my most annoying things to me. When you say something and they disagree, mismatching, then they say the same thing. Why? Number one, because they can't hear. They can't hear. They don't have the self-discipline to listen to anyone other than themselves. Some people just can't take in. They can't listen. So they'll just block and say, oh, no. And then they'll explain the thing and actually say what you said. Mismatcher can't empathize and enter into another person's way of seeing or feeling. Number 3, they're too full of themselves to take in from the outside. They're arrogant. They're just so full of themselves, there's no room to take anybody else in. They're too full of unprocessed information. We talked about the importance of the hygiene of processing information and experiences. So they're actually suffering from inflation, or I call it inner inflammation. Number 5, they need to be the one with the right perspective. They're actually jealous. It's like, oh, they're jealous that you would be right. So they need to be the one who's right. And they want to draw attention to themselves as the know-it-all, as the expert. And number 7, they need to say things in their own words because they're a verbal processor and they can't actually think without speaking. Some people have to have their jaw moving in order for their mind to be moving. It's a sad state of things, but this is why a lot of people just talk too much. They talk over you and they don't listen. So now we're going to look at some other, I guess you could call them archetypes or stereotypes of people suffering from ego diseases. So I'm sure you all met the idealist, perfectionist, purist, fanatic, right? People that have to have the ideal, it has to be perfect, it has to be pure, and they're fanatic about it. And of course, this can lead to them being a control freak. They have to control the situation so they have it their way, which they think is the best way, which they think is the purest way. And, this is egotism that's driven by really an arbitrary standard. It's their standard of things. It's their standard of what is perfect. And they are so fixed on that, they can't see beyond their own perception of things. They can't see anybody else's point of view. They think they're right. And so they impose. They impose their standard on a group. You may have been, I've seen this in intentional communities where people, it's like, hey, let's live together. Let's share the resources. Let's share the land. Let's share finances. It's like, oh, wonderful. Yeah, everybody's heart's open in the beginning. And then you start to have meetings and it's like somebody sticks out and it's like, well, it has to be this way. This is the way it has to be, like this is the way they're doing it. And I agree with that. So, and they become rigid about it and there's no flow. And, they become the control freak in the group. And it really can bring things down to the point where I've seen a lot of communities just have to like disband because, they've got one person who just will not let it go. And they don't know how to work in a consensus manner and so forth. So yeah, it can be very annoying and very difficult to deal with. And this leads into the next one, the overachiever. The overachiever or the superachiever. They got to just do it all. They got to do the most. They got to be the best. And, this can be coming from a competitive spirit. And somebody mentioned that in the opening circle, but having a healthy competitive nature is good, can drive you forward. But then you ever play board games with people that are like so super competitive? They have to win. And it's not fun.
Who cares?
Right? It's a game, right? It's just a game. But it's so deeply entrenched in their ego nature
Yes.
to win. They have to do everything to win.
And it's Christmas, and it's like, why are we fighting?
Yeah, like
Settlers.
lighten up, we don't have to be so serious in life. And yeah, some people, they're just driven to be the best, and their competitive spirit just goes overboard, and it's the same with capitalism, capitalism allows, competition, which spurs on innovation, which is good. You look at countries that don't have much capitalism and there's not so much innovation and invention. But then some people just go too far and abuse the privilege. The next syndrome, calling these syndromes, is the good girl, the good boy, right? You got to be the good girl. You're not in your head. You can relate to that one. Yeah. Where does that come from? It's really a symptom of poor parenting, where the parents is like, oh, good girl, you did that good. And, it's fine to a certain point to give praise, but we can give too much praise. Like, for example, if mom makes the dinner and it's your job to do the dishes, she doesn't have to praise you for doing the dishes. Good girl, you did the dishes. No, that's the expectation. That's your job. She did dinner and you did the dishes. So you don't have to overpraise people for just doing their job, because then they get addicted to it. Then they expect it. And if they don't get it, then there's this fear that it's like, oh, I'm the bad girl now. I'm not going to get the praise, or I'm not approved, or maybe I'm going to get reprimanded for that. So then it gets even worse, because this addiction to praise, to be the good girl, then you start to put on the good girl facade, and that's the false self. Like, oh, I want people to think I'm a good girl, so I got to put on the smile and dress the part, and it really doesn't ring true. When people give you that false smile, and I'm good, I'm good, look at me, I want you to think I'm good. uh it really pulls the person out of their center. And besides that, we didn't come here to just be good or bad. This idea of good and bad is really not suitable in measuring our progress as an evolving ego being. We're here to evolve. We're here to be bad sometimes, make mistakes, and not be reprimanded. Reprimanded is not the way. What's needed when you make mistakes is better instruction, better information. It's not like, oh, you were a bad boy this time. Like, no, show me the better way. Teach me, instruct me, instead of reprimanding me and saying, oh, I'm not a good boy today, I'm a bad boy today, so tomorrow I got to be a good boy. And it really does put the ego kind of into this ping-ponging back and forth that isn't helping it progress on the evolutionary path, becoming a higher being. We're just seeking being good instead of bad. And what's really needed is to have support to go in through the doorway of our mistakes into our unconscious, into our shadow side, and find out what's there, what's acting out, maybe that's causing problems. We need a culture of conscious inner workers and supporting each other to go, oh, what's going on in my life? Will you help me to go inside, using something like focusing to explore what's in the unconscious shadow side, and to bring that out, bring out the powers that are there, rather than these two-dimensional images of like the good girl and the good boy. Is that clear? Next is the egoist as criminal. The development of a criminal mind. And it's kind of like the ogre, where we all contribute to the creation of criminals. Society creates criminals and criminal thinking because we're not addressing needs of human beings. So the criminal mind is looking for ways to provide for its own needs, but it's having to go outside the narrow box of what's acceptable and find criminal actions to do that. So it's really the environment that we create as a culture that determines the type of mind and the type of egos that are growing within it. And we'll look at that in the next session when we look at the remedies for ego diseases and how important environment plays into that. Then there's the martyr syndrome, where people, they want to get recognized for making great sacrifices and doing kind of grandiose things. But this can often be coming from a place of low self-esteem. They don't really feel very valued, so they figure by doing, martyrdom, they will be, considered kind of like a saint. But it's overcompensating. It's overcompensating for this low self-esteem. And it's not to say that there isn't a place for self-sacrifice, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in a grandiose way and something that's chronic where you're always the one making the sacrifice so that you can up your value. And this is another thing. A lot of people are trying to up their value either through the martyr syndrome, making sacrifices, or the opposite, they push other people down. Instead of making sacrifices for other people, they put them down in a way to lift themselves up. Then there is the messianic complex, where, this Messiah nature is thinking that it's here to save others. Like they're on earth, God put them on earth to save the earth and save others. But they're often really not embracing their own issues and problems. They think everybody else has got problems in their lives. But generally people with messianic complex, and I had that, I suffered from that when I turned 20. I'll explain that next week, but huge ego blind spots where you're not seeing yourself. You're just looking at the problems of other people. And so you put yourself up on a pedestal as a Messiah. Problem with putting yourself up on a pedestal, a step in any direction is a step down. So, and this leads on to the imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome is a psychological state where people doubt their own abilities. They feel they're actually an imposter of some kind. They doubt their abilities, their accomplishments, and skills, and they fear that they'll be exposed as a fraud, as an imposter. Anybody ever feel like that? It's like,
Yeah.
ooh, yeah, I'm an imposter and I'm going to be found out. You feel it all the time. Yeah, I mean that can settle in. You can settle in where you feel like you're a fraud with your whole life. And it's usually there's something to that, like you're maybe not aligned with your true self. And you're just, kind of cobbled together personality, and you live this personality, but behind the backdrop or not the backdrop, the facade of the personality is, it's like the wizard in the Wizard of Oz. He's got this big mask there. It's like, I'm the great and powerful Oz, but we find out afterwards he's just this little humbug who's quite insecure. Then there's the egoist as rebel. And, to have the capacity to rebel can have its upside and its downside. And who here feels they have like something of a rebellious nature? Well, not everybody, but yeah, I could certainly say that I feel like I'm in that camp and tend to
Still in the camp.
rebel against things. But whether it's of value or not, it depends on the context, on how the rebellion is being expressed. And sometimes it's misplaced resistance. Misplaced, like you're rebelling, but you don't really need to be. Or it can be, misplaced superpower, which what I mean here is like if a person was exposed to an authority figure who was abusive while you're growing up, like your parents or religion or government or something like that, then, it might be healthy to rebel against that abusive person who's in an authority position, just trying to insert themselves as your super ego telling you what to do, and you follow and you find yourself in an abusive situation. So yeah, naturally, rebellion would be the healthy choice. But I see people out there that have developed kind of this generalized rebellious nature where it doesn't matter who it is or what, like they just rebel against any kind of authority. If anybody tells them what to do, it's like, no. As soon as you tell me what to do, I'm just going to say no. Right? As soon as they have a sense that something's imposing their idea or their will on them, they will rebel, they'll resist, they'll react. And that can become a knee-jerk reaction that may actually work against you, because there may be situations where somebody's trying to help you, they've got good advice, or they're trying to open a door for you, and you resist and you walk away from it. So yeah, the rebel can be coming from kind of an inflated ego place. Then there's the I don't care what others think of me syndrome, right? People that just kind of get into this thing. I don't care anymore. I don't care what people think about me. And I think there's something innate in all of us that do care. We do care about how people regard us. You know, we would like to be appreciated. I guess it comes from situations where people don't feel appreciated, they don't feel recognized, they don't feel valued, and so they just kind of go into this corner that says, I don't care what people think. But and that's kind of the ogre. You know, the ogre has this thing, I don't care, I'm just going to live in the swamp. But then we find out that ogres are like onions. And when you peel back the layers, they do care. Then there's ego tripping. It's kind of the opposite to the I don't care what people think. The ego tripper is obsessed with what others think about them. And so they either try to do things that make them look good, or if they're not doing things that make them look good, they might just choose to be like an idiot in their mind and go, well, everybody likes me, everybody thinks I'm great. They just make up this fictional story in their mind that, oh yeah, all the women love me, they think I'm great, you know. And they just trip on that. They just feed their ego with this false narrative that is like a drug trip in a way. So yeah, it can become an addiction to the drug of thinking, you know, everybody thinks you're so great. And this leads us, you know, coming to the end now, the smell of narcissism. The smell of narcissism. I can't leave this off of the list, which, you know, sometimes is thought of as the love of self. And to quote Oscar Wilde, how can you not love Oscar Wilde? To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance. To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance. So now, to love yourself is certainly a healthy thing, but it becomes a problem when it turns into narcissism. And we'll talk about narcissism in a moment, but another quote is, narcissism is a strange disease. It makes everybody sick except the person who has it. The definition of is a narcissistic personality disorder is a mental health condition in which people have an unreasonably high sense of their own importance. They need and seek out attention and want people to admire them. People with this disorder may lack the ability to understand or care about the feelings of others. Unless the feelings of others are about them. They don't care what other people think or feel unless it's about them. That reminds me of the conversation with a narcissist and somebody else. The narcissist was talking about themselves and says, Oh, well, enough about me. Enough of me. What about you? What do you think of me? So this idea of the narcissist, that actually is derived from a Greek myth about this beautiful young man who mistreated people who admired him for his good looks, his beauty, and there many suitors came to him, but he was abusive and mistreated them. He rejected them in an unkind way. And so he was actually beautiful on the outside, but quite unkind and not beautiful on the inside. And so he was, in fact, put under a spell by the goddess Nemesis, who saw this and said, enough of this abusive nature by narcissists, and put him under a spell. So he went to this pond and looked at his own reflection on the surface and fell in love with himself. I would say it was more than falling in love with himself. He became obsessed and addicted to his own beauty, at least his external beauty. And he couldn't move. He was so addicted to looking at himself night and day. He stayed there, eventually became planted into the earth and turned into a plant, a flower, which we call the narcissus flower. We also call the daffodil, which is the smell of narcissism in the daffodil. But to me, the real cause of narcissism points to the core issue that we're all dealing with as an ego center. Back to this idea we began with at the beginning, that we're all centers, that the narcissist cannot move beyond its own center. We use the term stuck up. The person is stuck up. They're really stuck in their own center. And they have not found some meaningful way to move beyond their own center. So we can call them egocentric. They're egocentric in an unhealthy way that leads to this egotism or disease state of their ego. Their predominant focus is on themselves, and they cannot move beyond that. They cannot connect with others. Narcissist could not connect with, he just was addicted to all the praise. People coming, oh, they want to marry me. They want to marry me. Oh, he never married because he just was addicted to all this adoration. So they cannot connect with others, including something greater than themselves. I would say that someone with a narcissistic nature cannot even connect with a higher aspect because they don't believe there's anything higher than themselves. They don't believe there's anything greater than themselves. So they really are stuck in themselves in a form of slavery and imprisonment in themselves. So we're going to get into some of the remedies of this next week. And we've talked a bit of that. I'll just recap a little bit on how we need to build a healthy sense of self and a healthy personality, but not be fixated on it. We need to build a personality that allows us to interface with other personalities and what's deeper beyond the personality at their core. And this is why we live in a universe of duality and polarity. We're meant to have the polarity with others. This is one of the reasons why, there's the polarity between male and female. It creates a dynamic of self and other that generates ideas, activity, innovation, and so forth, and helps us to move in and out of our own center. So, yeah, we'll get into more of that in the next class. And I want to say also, as announcements, next class, we're looking at the remedies. It's class 7, but I'm adding another class 8, a bonus class called Ego Death, Psychoactive Substances, New Shamanism, and the Christ Archetype. So the home play
No, it.
is continuing with the Vipassana meditation as we did tonight. Just, can be a 5-minute thing where you really bring your mind into your body and observe and try not to get distracted. And if you get distracted, come back to the practice. And of course, the other practice is the Steiner concentration practice with a pen or some object, 2 minutes, just generating thoughts. See if you can do that without your mind wandering. Even if you find it boring, tell your mind, like a dog, come back, sit, stay. And then the other practice we've been doing, I'm not adding any new ones this week. We're just going to keep with these ones. The third one is the Ruck Shao, where you take 5 or 10 minutes in the evening, close your eyes, and review the day in reverse. See yourself from a higher perspective, like you're looking down. Oh, there's Mata. I was sitting on the couch at Jesse's loft, and I was taking notes. And there was a TV there, and there was a circle of people. And before that, I came in with Sina, and we came on a Uber. And before that, I had dinner at home. And what did I eat? And you remember what you ate. And before that, in the afternoon, I did this. So you go all the way back to the morning and see if you can remember and see if you can actually see these things in your mind's eye.
That word.
Ruckshau is spelled Ruckshau. It's a German word that means back show or backward review. And then the contemplation question for the week is, what functions and diseases are speaking to you personally that need work in your life? And also those around you. And are there other functions and diseases that you can identify? And when you look at them from a personal perspective, are you seeing it objectively or subjectively? We've talked about, objective and subjective perspective of things. So you can add that to it. And also articulate this to another person or two about the functions and diseases that need work in your life. See if you can share that with another person. Always helpful to put things into words.